morning. My name is Aimee Knight, and as Reed said, so the talk that I'm giving, I'm kind of going to try to set the floor for everybody to learn today, and hopefully we have people of all different skill sets in the audience. I'm kind of curious, how many people in here have been either programming or just, how many people in here have been programming less than 3 years? Good. Okay. How many people have been doing like functional programming less than a year? Okay, good. So that's good. Anyways, so before we do anything, the title of my talk is Getting Comfortable Being Uncomfortable. So I'm going to make you guys all feel really uncomfortable here. So normally I have a slide before this, and it's a very short video. I was a competitive figure skater for about 15 years before I made a complete 180 switch and decided to get into programming. Two very, very, very different fields. But I want everybody to stand up out of their seats. This is going to be really, really, really awesome for a bunch of guys. I might take a video too. Okay, so don't start it yet because I want to get this on video. But I want everybody to put their hands up over their head. It's going to be great. And you're going to spin around. Don't do it yet. Don't do it yet. You're going to spin around one time. Okay. I'll tell you guys when I'm ready. Oh, wait, right. Okay, ready, set, go. Okay. Yep, okay, great. Like I said, so I hope everybody's feeling super uncomfortable now. That's the point, because as I wrote this talk, originally this talk was designed just for programming in general, but Reed talked to me, and I've done a little bit of functional programming in my second job of actually doing element production, and I've done a little tiny bit of Haskell with a mentor, and also just like being in JavaScript, you're exposed to some functional concepts. So this talk, although it was specifically meant just for junior developers trying to become senior, I thought, there's a lot of similarities, whether you're learning like object-oriented programming or functional programming, but I am going to specifically get into like some functional programming concepts that I thought, as a newer developer, were really beneficial to me. So, all that to say, let's get started. I'm going to kind of go over, there's two parts of my talk. There's the first half, which is meant for people who are new to programming, what has worked for me, and that's kind of my advice for newer developers, what you may want to try, what may work for you. The second half of my talk, though, is for more advanced developers. If you're working with newer developers, specifically functional, and you're doing functional programming, what things are really good, like low-hanging fruit, that you can start doing to get newer developers up to speed on your team. So, let's get started. Uh-oh. Well, oh, there it goes. I think there's a delay. Oh, it doesn't seem to be going. Okay. So let's talk about the numbers for a little bit and why I think this is important. So I'm not going to go through every single year here, but you can see that from 2012 to 2022, the demand for developers is expected to grow by 33%. There are 60 plus schools right now in the United States for programming, and I am a bootcamp graduate. So you can kind of see that, in 2013, which is when I got started, there were only 2,000 students that graduated from a boot camp. Last year, that number has dramatically increased. You can kind of see the progression there, all the way to 23,000. And then this little GIF. So if you look down at the bottom, if we start at like 1978, and you can see up to 2014, this shows the jobs that are most common in each state, if you look, software development is actually going to show up on the map. So again, this is kind of just, I'm trying to hit home this point that there are more and more developers entering the industry, and not just we want to funnel them into programming in general if they're good candidates for it, but specifically for functional programming conference, why do we want to get newer developers into functional programming? So what I'm going to talk about, how do we effectively funnel these new developers into functional programming? Like I said, boot camps and college are really good at producing a lot of newer developers, but they're not so good at introducing people to functional programming, and they're not so good at taking a newer developer and getting them to the point where they are productive members of a team. Why do I like functional programming from a newer developer standpoint? So one thing that I think was really, really helpful when I got started is having constraints. So if you give a newer developer just like the world, it's not always so beneficial. If we think about like a little kid, usually you're going to set some parameters for them to do certain things in, and that's going to make things a little bit easier for them to learn. So I think functional programming offers these constraints because it limits the number of things that can go wrong, and so I actually think it is easier to learn as a newer developer. And the talk also is going to kind of acknowledge, what this process was like for me. Like we talked about, I liked one of those slides that they had up about, don't compare your beginning to someone else's middle, because there's a lot of stuff that goes in that we tend to forget. We're very technical people, and sometimes we like to think of things as like binary, and the real world outside of our computers is not always like that. So it's kind of easy to forget all these different factors that come into play in our journey. So a little bit about my story. Like I said, I spent most of my life as a competitive figure skater. I went to college. I just did marketing in college because my plan was just to skate the rest of my life. But junior year in college, I kind of thought, I don't know if I want to do this. This is, I'm done with skating, and marketing is not really that exciting, and I need something that I am passionate about. I need a new hobby. And I was working with some developers, and they had a site just built an expression engine. So again, I feel really silly talking about this stuff at a functional programming conference where there's people writing Haskell, but yeah, I got started with PHP and WordPress and Ruby on Rails and expression engine. After I got started with that, I decided to go back for a second degree because I thought that was the best journey for me. But a little bit into that second degree, I thought that was just not really cutting it either. They handed me a book on DHTML, which this was like only a couple of years ago, and that was pretty outdated. So then I decided to go the bootcamp route. And I went to one called the Nashville Software School, which is what landed me in the South here. Okay, and a lot of my talk, like Reed said too, I'm going to focus some of this on JavaScript because although JavaScript is not at all a purely functional programming language, there are some functional concepts within JavaScript, so I think that JavaScript is one of those languages that is kind of low-hanging fruit that it's a good language to get people started with some functional programming concepts. And so when I was at NSS and when I was a very new developer, I kind of had, some people were doing Ruby on Rails and then some people were doing JavaScript, and, I saw this tweet and it just kind of really spoke to me because I thought, I could go the JavaScript route or go the Ruby on Rails route. I want to go like the bigger, more exciting route. Then I saw this, and the point of this slide is this really piqued my interest. I saw JavaScript as being pretty challenging, and I saw this as a way to get plugged into the JavaScript community. So we're all at a conference, which is a great way to get plugged into the community. For a newer developer, I would say, seek out whatever you can. Come to the Functional Knox programming meetup, stuff like that. Then I saw this. I was this like very impressionable young developer, and I thought, yes, JavaScript it is. And this is how I really got introduced to some functional programming concepts from the beginning. And I wanted everybody to take a look at this slide. Like I know, we probably have a lot of purists here, and JavaScript is not a purely functional programming language by any means. But if we're looking to get some newer developers into functional programming, I think that JavaScript is a great place to get started. If you look at a lot of the boot camps and you look at what languages people are getting introduced to, you can see Ruby on Rails is still pretty big, but JavaScript is really the big one. So if we are looking for newer developers to work with, JavaScript is the JavaScript ecosystem is really a great place to pull people from. There you go, thank you. Anyway, so, why JavaScript? Or you might have some people who are in Haskell and you think, oh my God, what in the world have I gotten myself into? So I'm making the parallel there for JavaScript. For me, I had done a lot of Ruby on Rails. I went into JavaScript land, and it was very, very different. It was hard for me as a newer developer. In Rails, you have these in Ruby on Rails, you have generators, which is totally different from a generator in JavaScript. But it's just like some basic scaffolding, type a couple commands, and your project is kind of ready to go. And in JavaScript, Node ecosystem, you don't at the time didn't really have anything like that. And so I just thought, what have I gotten myself into? You have asynchronous flow for a new developer. That's kind of callback hill can be a little bit hard to wrap your mind around. But the point was, I really, really, really just plugged away, and I started getting better. I was reading this Hacker News thread, and I found some people, they're actually specifically talking about me, and there were a couple of mentors, and they were saying nice things about me, and I felt like I was just lost in the sauce. I couldn't understand why people were giving me compliments. I got asked to go on some podcasts. I was talking to someone here earlier, so I do a podcast. I'm a panelist on a podcast called JavaScript Driver, and John's been on the podcast before. So listen to his episodes. But so I got to go on these podcasts. I started helping to organize some conferences and meetups. I got a substantial raise at work. Like I said, I was totally I felt completely out of my element. So get comfortable being uncomfortable. Okay, so you want to be a functional programmer, right? So when I was just getting started in programming, I thought, I want to be a developer. And I think an important thing to keep in mind is that employers probably aren't hiring you to solve their most complex problems, so keep that in mind. If you're not making mistakes, then you're not doing anything. I'm positive that a doer makes mistakes. I really like that. So don't hold back from applying for jobs. That's your employer's decision whether or not to hire you. And keep in mind, sucking at something is usually the first step to getting better at something. So making some mistakes is perfectly normal. Which brings me to lessons learned for newer developers. So you might ask, what programming language, what functional programming language should I start with? Do I start with Scala? Do I start with Haskell? Do I start with Elm? Do I just start with JavaScript? Well, it's not purely functional programming language. How do I find a mentor? How do I find somebody who's going to help get me started in this? So I think that those are great questions, but it's not necessarily the number one thing to think about. Like I said, I'm going to outline these steps that I've taken, but they're usually just going to kind of be organic, and it's going to look a little bit different for everybody, so try not to focus so much on those things. I love this quote, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. So a lot of times when I am trying to solve something, or whether I'm just learning something new, I want to hurry up and I want to get it done, but sometimes you have to go slower, and that's actually what's going to be faster in the end. So my point here is You can still use functional programming, but you can start in moderation by getting started in JavaScript, like React, Redux. There's a lot of functional concepts in there. Elm is a really, really good place to get started if you're newer. Also, don't be this guy. You know, contrary to popular belief, if you want to get plugged in and start learning, and you want to start learning, you really want to get plugged into the community. So attend hackathons and meetups. If you're trying to find a job, this is a great way to stand out as a newer developer. Okay, hard work beats talent. So, you know, as a newer developer, you're going to have a lot to prove, and you have to keep in mind that people are going to be making a bet on you. So, how can you make that decision easier? You want to be super excited, as long as that's authentic excitement. Be excited about what you're doing. Let that passion, enthusiasm, and excitement show. You can look for ways to contribute on GitHub. That's a really good way to get started. Dave Thomas, who wrote this book called The Pragmatic Programmer, he kind of stressed in a podcast at one point that it's important to have some formal education, but that formal education is only going to take you so far. You really need to be passionate and have a solid work ethic. Those are the kind of developers that people want to work with and hire. Your number one job requirement when you're getting started is to be a lifelong learner. Things are always changing, and again, you can go read docs. Your job is not to memorize documentation. Your job is to get good at learning. So this is one thing I love about functional programming is which I love-hate relationship. It really stretches my mind. I did a lot of more object-oriented programming, so when I got into functional programming, I really liked that it was stretching my mind and it's helping me think about things in a very different way than I was used to. Keep in mind that all jobs are not created equal. So when you're looking for your first job, you want to try to find one where you're going to get code reviews, because that's actually a great form of mentorship. And then testing. I put testing on there because I find that a lot of newer developers, sometimes they get really excited about having a job where potentially their salary is going to increase. But I think these kinds of things that I have on the slide are far more important than how much money you're going to be making, because these are the kind of things that you're going to learn early on that are going to set you up for success. So you're at your first job, but you see the code base for the very first time. Or maybe you're popping open a book or a tutorial online or something, and you see Haskell, or you see this gargantuan code base for the first time. If you're anything like me, when I got to my first job, outside of just my little toy applications, and I saw the code base, and I had 7 different APIs that I had to get cloned, 5 ETLs, a UI, this is how I felt. Same thing when I was working with my mentor, and we read a book called Wrapping Algorithms together. I did the JavaScript implementation of the algorithms. He did them in Elm and Haskell, and the first time he ever showed me some Haskell, this is very much how I felt. Thank you. Uh-oh. Perfect. Okay, so hard work with practical approaches. So boot camps for me, or if you're in school, I think that that's kind of designed to get you 20% of the way to 80% of the way. The rest of the learning that you're going to be doing is really done on the job. And when you get to your first job, oh gosh. Thank you. When you get to your first job, you probably have thoughts that this is what you're going to feel like. But in reality, you're probably going to feel much more like this. Over and over and over again. So getting up to speed, I really like starting with the tests. And when I say start with the tests, I mean starting by writing tests and also reading tests. Reading them is a great form of documentation, but writing them is going to force yourself to understand what you're implementing. Also, break stuff. Whenever I get introduced to a new code base, I will usually try to ask the person kind of where the entry point of the application is, and then I'll start sticking debuggers and console logs in their debugger statements as I start tracing the application to understand the different paths. So it's a really, really, really good way to get up to speed. Okay, baby steps for newer developers. Again, I would focus on having a firm understanding of closures and recursion. This is a really, really, really simple place to get started. These are like core concepts, and even if you're just doing JavaScript, these are things, whether or not you go full on into a purely functional programming language, just understanding closures in JavaScript is going to give you a better understanding of how the heap and stack work. It's going to give you a much better understanding of how scope works in JavaScript. And then recursion, you can practice rewriting some of the for loops in your code in a recursive way. Keep in mind when you're getting started that code is not just for computers, it's for people too. And so a lot of times newer developers, we're really focused on getting our code to compile or our code to work. But as we want to get to the point where we're working with a team, we need to have our code be more maintainable and testable, and it needs to be written in a way that our team members can understand it. So I think, again, these are kind of the baby steps that I took in functional programming. Started using some of the canonical functional programming methods like map, filter, and reduce. If you're, in most programming languages will have implementations of these kinds of methods. These are really good ways to get started just with little baby steps. And then for me, when I say readable, extendable, testable code, really what sticks out in my mind when I started to, the light bulb started to go off for me why I might be interested in functional programming, I was working in an Angular code base, and this was post-Angular, Angular 2, so we had $scope everywhere. And people were not passing in that $scope into their methods because it's global, you didn't have to. And we had just some terrible, terrible bugs because we were had these different methods all over the place that are mutating something that is global, and you had to you would move methods around and you have these bugs, you have no idea where they're coming from. And I just thought, how did this happen? I didn't really have any kind of idea of functional programming. But I realized, okay, so I'm in a very object-oriented framework here. How can I make this a little bit easier? And someone introduced me to the concept of pure functions. So even though I'm in an object-oriented programming language, I can pass in that $scope, and at least I can see in my method, what I'm mutating globally. And so I'm kind of trying to surface what I'm getting passed in, surface the side effects. It's a really good way to get started. Alright, I think there's a delay, so sometimes I press the button and it takes a minute. So hard work with practical approaches, obey the Boy Scout rule. So that just means leave the code better than you found it. So for me, this meant that whenever I had this code that was mutating global state, when I was getting started, I was writing this Angular code, that meant ripping out sections of that and trying to extract it into a pure function. Not only did that make the code easier to read, it made testing a heck of a lot easier as well, because all of a sudden I had this super simple method that I could test because I knew the inputs and the outputs. I think it's really important to move past tutorials. When we're getting started, we can get a little bit engrossed in what we're doing, but really, like I said, your real learning is going to come on the job. So the sooner that you can start doing this kind of thing, solving real world problems in production or open source or something like that, that's where you're really going to learn. And I would just encourage people to not get discouraged. At my first job, I started reading some RFCs and stuff like that. I was really intimidated, but they were actually not as bad as I thought they were going to be. Ask questions. So for me, my love for learning kind of exceeds my pride, so this is a little bit easier for me. Prepare for overtime. So this is a little controversial to some people, but I think if you're a newer developer, you probably should prepare to spend a little bit extra time learning things. I usually spent 90 minutes or so a day extra my first year on the job, trying to level up, and then some additional time on the weekend. To that end, I think it's important to work hard, but you also want to work smart. I love this quote. Think twice, code once. So what does that mean? Start with documentation. I think it's really important to have an opinion about the code that you're writing. You need to be able to explain the choices you're making. So, if you're just copying and pasting and you can't explain why you did something, then that's a problem. If you are writing code, you should understand every single line of code that you're writing. If it's there, it needs to have a purpose. Get comfortable with abstraction. This is really, really, really hard for me, especially with functional programming. This is something that really stretches your mind. So at your job, it's your responsibility to ship quality code. So you might have to get a little bit comfortable with abstraction. When you're at home is your time to go on a deep dive. Practice makes permanent, not necessarily perfect. So reading code and stuff like that is really important. But there's a difference between reading books and actually, writing code. So you actually want to be doing certain problems, like, they have different websites, Code Wars, stuff like that, where you can go and, practice these things. Also, when you have a bug and you finally figured it out, I would say don't just solve the bug and move on. You want to sit back and figure out how you got there so that in the future you can go back and trace your steps and be able to reproduce kind of that approach you took. You want to think about it as like a police officer surveying a crime scene. They don't just go about it randomly. When they debug something, they go about it very systematically. They take one small section of code and they move on to the next. So that's why I like being able to pass functions around and stuff like that, and not just have this one big method that's doing a bunch of things, because I can isolate where one thing is, and if there's a bug, I can just debug that one section of code. One thing at a time. So there's all the stuff we can learn, tons of different languages. But like I said a couple slides prior, the important thing here is to get better at learning. It's not to learn X, Y, and Z. It's to increase the speed at which you're able to learn new things. Skills are way more important than learning facts. So there's an overwhelming number of things to learn right now, but again, your responsibility and your focus should be getting better at learning things. I would say learn the paradigms of the language and then decide if you have a certain language or framework that you like. I'm a big fan in the JavaScript land of Kyle Simpson, and so rather than focusing on React, Redux, Angular 2, Vue, something like that, I think it's important to have a firm understanding of JavaScript. So don't focus so much on the frameworks and those kind of things. Focus on the paradigms. Focus on just functional paradigms before you decide, I definitely want to go into this specific language. Yep, so you want to have a level of mental awareness and take care of yourself. So, it's okay to take breaks. You might want to try practicing meditation because you're going to have these just moments your brain is going to explode. But that downtime is when your brain is actually really active and creative and solves the most complex problems. Stop calling yourself dumb. So I don't really like the fake it till you make it saying. I don't think you should fake things. But the exception would be with your self-talk, because eventually if you keep telling yourself dumb, you're going to start to believe it. So you might want to fake it till you make it with your self-talk. When you don't know how to do something and you come across a tough bug, remind yourself that it's an opportunity to learn something new. So it's all about framing the problem here. Keep in mind that you're not your code. Honest feedback is how you get better. Yep. Okay, so my last piece of advice for newer developers would be to pair up. You might think that you can only do pair programming with someone that is more senior than you, but I think that pairing up with people that are at your own skill level is actually really valuable as well. Back when I lived in Baltimore, I started this junior developer meetup, and we were actually really productive together. At my first job, I also started this junior Slack channel because I found we'd go to our planning meetings, and a lot of the developers would go around. The PM would say, does anybody have questions about what we're about to do in our next iteration? And everybody would say, yep, I know exactly what I need to do. And then people would get back to their desks and they would start typing away. I don't understand this, I don't understand that. So we started a Slack channel to try to discuss things amongst ourselves before we would have to go to the seniors. So you can learn from people that are at their own skill level. If you are fortunate enough to find a senior level mentor, though, you will find that I did some research, and developers who received mentoring were promoted 5 times more often than those who weren't. So if you can find this, it's going to be super beneficial. If you can't find it formally, you can get it in the form of code reviews, just like on open source projects. That's a really good way. You can just ask if you can carry out that work. Number 1 lesson learned before we move on to my advice for senior developers is that it's not going to be easy. It was a lot like my path in skating. I took a lot of falls before I got better. Never, ever allow yourself to get comfortable. Like Reed said, that's how we get better. That's why we're all here. So we want to be challenged. So you already have this junior thing down. You feel like you already have your footing, either programming or functional programming, and you might ask, how can I help? So I'd say the first thing is suppress these feelings. You are reviewing someone's code, or someone comes to you with questions, and you just why are you asking me this? Try to suppress these feelings. Because the newer developers that you're working with are probably feeling like this. I want to imagine you're adopting a dog. So, do I want to hire a junior? Do I want to hire a mid-level, a senior? You might have to ask yourself, this junior developer or this developer, I have a team of functional programmers, this developer has 0 functional programming experience. Do I really want to make this investment? You think about it like you're adopting a dog. You can get an older dog. They might already be house trained, but they probably come with some bad habits too. That's no good. If you have a puppy, puppies are notorious for making a mess, like ripping up toilet paper and having accidents all over the place. But if you're patient and you take some time, you can eventually train them to do some pretty cool stuff. So you have to remember when you're bringing on a new developer, you are partially responsible for their success, not entirely, but partially. So these newer people that you might be bringing on, they don't necessarily have a lot to show just yet. So what you can look for is eagerness to learn, and you can hire for that. So I want to talk about some actual things that you need to do, though, because it's not just about bringing on a newer person. There are actually some steps that you can take to set yourself up for success. So you want to establish a culture of communication on your team. And not just verbal communication, but you want to start paying attention to nonverbal communication. A lot of time, newer developers are going to feel intimidated to speak up. So instead of just waiting for questions to come to you, you can be proactive and be direct and just say, does this make sense? A lot of times if you have a direct question for someone like that, they'll feel a little bit more encouraged to speak up and say, no, I necessarily don't. Learn to empathize and sincerely listen. A lot of people coming into programming now, as we saw in the slides earlier, there's a lot more people kind of getting funneled in, and that's actually really valuable because it makes our community more diverse. We have a lot of different backgrounds that offer new insight. Frame your conversations accordingly. So the very first time I heard the word referential transparency, I was like, oh my God, what is this? Why are we using these scary words? But really, if someone someone just explains to me that referential transparency is the same thing as I say, like I have a function that's 5 plus 5, I have a function that's taking in two numbers, 5 plus 5, and it sums them up to 10, I can trade that in for 10, and that's what referential transparency is. If somebody would have just explained it to me like that, I probably would have gotten it within 30 seconds and not been so scared. But I would say the same thing, if I said to a group of developers that the skater that was on TV, she cheated her triple axel and she had a bad rap. People would have no idea what I'm talking about, but I could get up and actually demonstrate what that meant. I could say, what cheated means. It just means that rather than landing with my toe facing this way, I land this way, so I actually didn't get a full rotation. Bad rap, I could actually demonstrate it or type it out in the code. It means that my leg came too high. So be careful with the words that you're using. You might think, well, it's important for people to learn the terminology, but I think, take baby steps. It's like an iterative approach. Take tiny little baby steps to get there. Pay attention to project management. This is one thing, when I say project management, I mean offering constraints to people and breaking down tasks. One thing we do where I work that I really, really like is rather than just having a big story and everybody goes off and starts implementing things, we spend a lot of time subtasking and thinking through the stories. So for functional programming, like I said, I really like that functional programming offers me constraints because it limits the number of things that I need to keep in my head. So with project management, you want to pay attention to this with newer developers because it's going to offer those constraints. Also, when you hire somebody, you want to make sure that you're going to be able to trust them because there's nothing worse than I have a couple friends who were hired and their employers didn't necessarily have a plan mapped out for them. They didn't necessarily trust them, so they're kind of sitting there fiddling their thumbs. And if you have any newer developer who's worth hiring, they're going to be eager to learn and eager to start writing code. So they don't want to feel like this. They're going to end up leaving. You want to mentor and cultivate the juniors on your team because, if you are making an investment in this person, you want that investment to pay off, so you want them to be able to stick around. Any, developer that you bring on board that's newer and they're excited, they're going to want to keep learning, and if that learning stops, they're going to probably look elsewhere, and then your investment doesn't necessarily pay off. Preparing your code base. So this is really, really, really important. So we'll kind of get past the gray area and talk about some actual tangible things that you can do. I did some research and found out that when Microsoft started testing their code, they found that their defect percentages decreased between 40 and 90%. And this was specifically for TDD, and then they only saw a 5 to 35% increase in development time. So a lot of people say, I don't have time to write tests, but you can see, if you think about it, if you have 40 to 90% defects, the time it takes to go back, you have to context switch from what you are working on to back to the code that you were working on. That defect percentage is higher actually than the initial development time. So my point here is if you're kind of on the fence about testing, I think it's extremely valuable, not just for your code base, but it's going to be valuable for the newer members on your team because if you have unit tests, they have the speed of tests that they can run to make sure when they're going in there and they're tweaking things that they're not breaking anything. So if nothing else, start writing tests in tandem with bug fixes. Okay, preparing your code base. So one thing that I kind of got started doing and I think is really, really helpful, so when I say prepare your code base, this could be low-hanging fruit for a new member of your team as far as refactoring, but if we are in a language like JavaScript or something like that, usually the quick solution to things is just throw an if statement in here, an if statement in there, and all of a sudden the psychomatic complexity of your method has, expanded a ton. So I really like these linting rules. You can put in place linting rules for psychomatic complexity. For those people who maybe that could be a scary word. So psychomatic complexity just measures the paths that a method can take. So you can put in linting for that, and then also just to get away from syntactic complexity, you can start replacing some of your if statements with higher order functions like map and filter, reduce, like I talked about. Those are really good, easy ways to get started with functional programming. When I say style guide, I'm not talking about CSS. I'm talking about a team style guide, so there are multiple different ways to skin a cat. Let's agree upon the same way to do something, and we can even automate a lot of these things so that when you put up a code review, it's not a discussion between two people, it's completely automated. The computer just says, yep, you pass, no, you don't. And then comments. Usually the people who are afraid of comments are usually kind of the worst offenders. So don't be afraid to comment your code. That's why we have, that's why we're able to minify things, because that's why we have minifiers. We shouldn't be afraid of comments. These are all just really good tools to help newer developers get started in your code base. Write clean code. So yeah, clean is kind of, the term's like slightly nebulous, and there's a lot of opinions there, but when I say clean code, I mean code that's readable, extendable, testable. If you think about it, a lot of time a newer developer, they are going to go and copy and paste. They're going to look for examples in the code of, if they're having to add a feature, there's probably, something similar done before, and they're going to emulate exactly what you did. So if you introduce some tech debt at one point, and then you have a newer developer, and you bring on more and more developers, that tech debt is just going to multiply. Keep in mind that abstraction is not about being vague, it's about being precise. So practical approaches to collaborating productively. Again, like I talked about, we want to have a level of empathy, but code reviews, these are just like, it's the best place for mentorship. But I have some actual advice for code reviews. The first thing is, don't do this. We want to be cognizant when we do put up PRs too at the size of the code that we're putting up, and try to break it up in small chunks, because I'm prone to this, and probably many people are. You put up a huge PR, you might get up like 5 comments. You put up a 1-page file, you're going to get 5 comments too. So pay attention to this. No matter what the size of the code you're reviewing, seize the opportunity to teach. Also, kind of like I said at the beginning of this section, we want to offer constructive criticism. We don't want that puppy we're bringing up to wear a muzzle the rest of its life. As far as code reviews though, don't just tell somebody what to do. I think it's really valuable to ask questions. A newer developer, you want to encourage them to think through their answers. And so say, why did you do something this way? Or what do you think about doing it this way? Instead of just saying, do it this way. Pair programming. The number one thing is to admit it when you're not sure. And also it's going to be super painful if you already know the solution, but let the junior developer, let the newer developer drive. You want to allow the newer developer as well to make mistakes, because a lot of times people kind of have to learn it the hard way. Again, as you are actually the one programming, back to what I was saying earlier, keep in mind that if it's hard to write, it's probably going to be even harder to write tests for, and it's going to be even harder to read. Pro tip. So, if you're on the fence about whether or not to bring in somebody newer to your team, keep in mind that juniors can totally boost your career and increase your team's code quality, and I have proof for that. Remember when I talked about test coverage and style guides and sharing knowledge? When you think about it, as you're preparing for newer people on your team, the whole team is going to benefit. Maybe you've been putting some long hours lately, and the business just has all this stuff that they need done, and you can't ever learn anything new because you're always having to ship code, you can't ever slow down, and you're just feeling really, really, really burned out. Junior can totally fix that, because if you bring on a junior that is excited, that excitement is going to be super contagious. that, it's just the... There we go. Okay. Yep. So how many people have heard of like the Junior Dev for Life hashtag? Anybody in here? Yes. I love it. I have been programming now for like 3 or 4 years, and I still like to call myself a junior because I just like the mindset. Like I'm always learning. So Junior Dev for Life. But I did say I had proof. And so I did a little bit of research, and actually there were a lot of studies, and they found that mentors are 6 times more likely to be promoted and 20% more likely to get a raise. So maybe you're on the fence as to whether or not you want to spend time helping a newer developer get up to speed. You know, if you just look at the finances of it, it'll probably pay off for you. It's also just, you know, aside from that, it's a great way to pay back into the industry. We all got started somewhere. It's going to help you have a better idea of how people perceive you. And then functional programming in particular, you know, it's kind of unpopular in the real world. A lot of schools don't necessarily use it. I found it really interesting that Stanford now is taking, they used to teach just Java in their introduction to computer science curriculum. They're actually moving to JavaScript. And I think as part of this, you know, they can start introducing some functional concepts there, like with TypeScript. They can start introducing types there. They don't need to use Java for that. They can have like optional typing. But again, you know, if we want, as functional programmers, if we want the community to grow a little bit larger, because the more people we get in the community, the more diverse it is, the more we can learn, you know, we kind of have a responsibility as we get better and better to kind of shepherd other people along. Okay, so wrapping up. Above all else, we want to look at the big picture. Keep in mind that the journey, although sometimes we might at first glance think that it is just a super straight line and that it was not like this for some of the people we admire, chances are it probably looked a lot like this for them as well. So if you are uncomfortable, I want to leave you with this. Walt Disney was fired from his first job at a newspaper because he was told he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. Oprah was fired from her first job as a television reporter because she was told she was unfit for TV. Thomas Edison, when he was growing up, was told he was too stupid to learn anything. Jerry Seinfeld was booed off stage at one of his first shows. J.K. Rowling, as a lot of people probably know, she took Harry Potter to 12 different publishers before it was finally accepted. And Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team. So you are probably in very good company if you're feeling uncomfortable today.